Call to order the City Council work session for City of East Grand Forks for Tuesday, July 28th, 2020 is now 5 o'clock. City Clerk, please call roll.
Here.
Council President Mark Olson.
Here.
Council Vice President Brad Russell.
Here.
Council Members Glenn Spud.
Here.
Dale Helms.
Here.
Tim Riethel.
Here.
Tim Johnson.
Here.
Mark Mers.
Present.
Does term quorum. Number 1, Grand Forks, East Grand Forks South End Bridge Study. KLJ and ADJOURN representatives here to go through it. You had the floor. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Brian Gaddy. I'm with ADJOURN. We have Wade Frank here with KLJ. And then I believe we maybe have a couple people on the phone, but I'm not sure. Just other members of our team. They're just available in case there's any questions that pop up that we need help with, but I don't expect any of that right now. So yeah, we're here to present the South End Bridge study. Just a bit of a background. We went through a kind of a competitive pursuit of this back in October timeframe. There was 5 firms that submitted, and ultimately the team of KLJ ADJOURN was selected. This study is a hydraulic analysis. It came about because the MPO did not have budget, I believe, to analyze this as part of their study. So it's kind of a supplement to the MPO study. It's one piece of a larger puzzle, I'll call it. I just want to be, I guess we can get into it here, but you know, the study objectives, before I get too far into this, one thing I want to be clear about is you're not going to see any clear recommendations on selecting a location or a height from this. At the end, I will give you some of my opinions and conclusions on this, but you're not going to see me say you should pick, you know, Elk's medium height alternative from this. Again, it's going to be fed into a bigger piece or bigger study later on that the MPO will have to continue on with. Because you will also need to look at things such as user delays, you know, the traffic study part of it would have to be part of the larger study. So what exactly did we do? So we developed conceptual bridge alignments, profiles, and the superstructure of the bridge itself. We identified the impacts from the future bridge, both hydraulically and on adjacent infrastructure such as properties, pipes, you know, levee infrastructure, flood walls, things of that nature. Then we tried to identify mitigation to minimize the water surface rise as a result of the new bridge. And then lastly, we performed a cost comparison of the alternatives relative to one another to try and give you a gauge of how each location and height kind of affects the price. So I'll turn it over to Wade here to talk about the bridge.
Sure. So the MPO study looked at quite a few different locations between the two cities, and our study was directed to look at these 3 locations, so Elks Drive, 32nd Avenue, and 47th Avenue. So we basically followed the locations that were set in the MPO study. As the study developed, we did modify the way 32nd ties in on the East Grand Forks side a little bit, and we'll get into that later. And we based our costs and impacts on the same roadway section that was in the MPO study, which is a 2-lane road with a bike path on one side. So just some bridge terminology, just to make sure we're all on the same page here. This isn't necessarily what the bridge would look like, but just so you know what we're talking about as we start talking about hydraulics and stuff like that. So beam and deck makes up superstructure depth. So when we talk about structure depth, superstructure depth, etc., that's what we're talking about, is the combined depth of the beam and the thickness of the roadway surface. When we talk about span, we're not talking about the overall length of the bridge. We're talking about the distance between support piers that support the structure as you go along. And then the traffic barrier is part of the superstructure. So in some cases, particularly for the medium bridge options, that can be an obstruction to water too, you know, as the water gets higher and higher. So that's another term that we'll use. And then as far as our study goes, it's really early in the process to be really designing bridges. So we just based it on some typical beam sizes that are available, concrete beam sizes that are routinely used in the bridge industry in the area. And so for example, a 45-inch deep beam can span 100 feet. And that total depth of the beam in the deck is 5¼ feet. 81-inch beam, quite a bit bigger, can span farther, 165. And then the structure depth goes up correspondingly. So a lot of numbers on this, and I'm not going to get into it too much, but what we did do is put together different options. So down the left side we have the corridors, Elks 32nd and 47th, and we just roughed out a bridge length for each of those at low, medium, and high. And then within that, we provided options of different numbers of spans and different sizes of beams. And then that corresponds to, as you get longer spans, the width of the pier that supports those spans gets wider. And the reason all that is important is trying to find the right trade-off between how deep the structure is versus how deep or how wide the piers are, because both block water. So this was just intended to give the hydraulic modelers some options and flexibility to kind of narrow in on things as they were going. So back to Brian.
Yeah, a few other key terms that you'll hear me reference a lot as I run through this is just rise. So again, that's just going to be the difference in the existing river elevation versus the new river elevation when you put in the new bridge. So that's what we're measuring when we talk about rise. Next would be the river gauge. You're going to notice all the elevations are relative to the Sorley Bridge or DEMERS Avenue gauge, just to make it a common point of reference. That's what everyone's used to hearing, what they understand, so 97 flood was a gauge height of 54 feet. So you're going to see everything referenced relative to that. 100-year event, that's the main event that we looked at. That would be the 1% probability in any given year. And this is important when it relates to FEMA and impacts on insurable structures and structures that may lie within the floodplain. Next one would be the design event. So the flood protection systems for both the cities was designed for a 210-year event. And that was, the Corps of Engineers event selected, which is close to that 97 flood stage. And freeboard, so that's just the difference between the design event and the top of your protection. So top of protection in East Grand Forks is 60 feet. That's both your levees and flood walls. And 3 or 4 feet of freeboard. So 3 feet to levees, 4 feet to flood walls is actually the distance to the design event peak elevation. So when you look at freeboard measured to the 100-year event, it's more like 7 and 8 feet. I'm going to get into this, but we're going to be talking about very, very small rises when you put in this bridge structure. So just keep in mind, you already have 3 or 4 feet of freeboard. And when we're talking about these rises, they are small, they will eat into your freeboard, but I'll get into that a little bit later. Next term would be just hydraulic mitigation or mitigation. And that's really commonly referred to when we're talking about, in the context of this study, would be like floodplain excavation. We're going to dig a hole to try and basically widen the floodplain or riverbank to pass that water past the bridge faster to make sure we don't cause a rise. And then last is just the insurable structure. That's just a structure that would lie within the 100-year floodplain that is typically insured, like if it has a mortgage on it, it would be insured under the National Flood Insurance Program. FEMA says you cannot have an impact on those structures. So we need to target a 0.00 rise on those structures. So that's when we do mitigation, that's what we're targeting, is to get that rise back down to existing conditions. So this is just a list of elevations to give you a reference of how the new or the future bridges that we looked at, how they relate to existing infrastructure, bridges in town. So as we look at, a low bridge option, it is actually pretty low, where you can see that Elks Drive one, it would close just, 6-7 feet beyond flood stage. And you can see the 43 feet there is the 10-year flood stage. So it's pretty low, and you're going to see a closure on something like that fairly frequently. It's just, it's not a bad thing, but it's just something that, right, when you're spending money on a bridge, you know, you're already spending millions of dollars, you would like it to be serviceable or open as much as possible. Especially as you're trying to commute, you know, the back and forth between the communities. So just, again, frame of reference, the low bridges are fairly low. And then when we look at the medium bridges, those are closer to, you know, between, I'd say, the Point Bridge to the Kennedy Bridge, when you list those closures. They're kind of pretty equal to the Kennedy Bridge in between there. So they're going to be open most of the time, but you get major flood events, they're likely going to be closed also. And then just the last one there is the high bridge option. We call that, you know, mostly just the high and dry. 63 feet would be actually the low beam of the bridge. It would never be closed. Like, both cities' flood protection systems would be overtopped before that bridge would actually be underwater.
Okay, so to get into a little bit of the details or expand on what Brian was just talking about, so we have just kind of a zoomed in view on each side of the river to talk about how the roadways and bridges would tie in. So as Brian was describing the low, medium, and high, so what you see, where's the mouse at? I lost it. All right. Why can't I find it? I don't know. It's moving too fast. All right. So this is the low. So basically the criteria that the technical team came up with was just connect the dots on each side of the river. Here's the bank on the East Grand Forks side and the bank on the Grand Forks side. So we're just going to draw a line between those. That's the low bridge. Going up a little further on the medium bridge, as you can see, Grand Forks side is higher, so we just kind of went with Grand Forks elevation plus a little bit and just went straight across. And then, as Brian said, up and over for the high bridge. So it goes over the flood protection on the Grand Forks side, and then I'll get to how it looks on the other side in a bit. So as Brian just said, low beam is above the levee for the high bridge. Mid bridge around 54, so it would likely be closed at about 49 feet due to the flood closure requirements. And this location, there is existing flood wall closure there, so that the infrastructure is already there for that. So that's why we are tying in down here rather than trying to hop over, since there's already a closure system in place on the Grand Forks side. And then the low bridge would be closed at 35 based on the low point of the road on the East Grand Forks side, because like I said, we're just tying in and connecting the dots. So on the East Grand Forks side, and we did this for basically all the locations and all the elevations, is we're tying into Reinhardt Drive basically. And so on the low one, see, we're way down here, but since there is a levee here, we climb up and get over that so that we're not putting a penetration through that and needing a flood wall closure on this side. And so it's similar with the rest of them. So all of them would go up and over and tie into Reinhardt. So that's the Elks Drive location, 32nd Avenue, and so it's basically the same story at each location, tied in there and went up as we go. So the results on this side, or on this location then, is, again, low beam is above the levee at the high bridge, closure at about 49 feet due to flood wall closure requirements, and closed at 38 feet based on the low point of the road. Now in this location, there currently is not a penetration through the flood protection system on the Grand Forks side, so this would require installation of new flood wall closure infrastructure on the Grand Forks side. Then going to East Grand Forks, kind of the same story that I just described, but a little bit different. So I mentioned earlier that we modified this 32nd Avenue alignment a little bit as the study went along, and that was due to recognition of, in the MPO study, the 32nd Avenue crossing crossed the levee north of here and landed inside the protected area, so to speak. So the thought process was, if we could move the crossing down, that would prevent the roadway from impacting flood protected property that's already available for development and is already protected. So we altered the alignment and kind of pushed it out away from the section line road to try to avoid impacting these properties here, and then tie into Reinhardt Drive, which from here goes up and over the levee. So that's the scenario on 32nd Avenue, and there's some mitigation differences in the options at 32nd that I think Brian will get into in a little bit here. So moving to 47th, similar story again. We have the high bridge above the levee, medium at close at about 51, and low close at 39. The one thing I didn't mention for all locations, as you get higher and higher, the road gets higher. That means the footprint of the embankment, as the road slopes down, it's a bigger footprint. So as you go higher, potential impacts to properties go up, potential impacts to other infrastructure, whether it's gate wells and things like that. So we're not getting into the level of detail of quantifying buyouts or any of that kind of stuff. We're just trying to acknowledge the differences between the different options, and we reflect that in the cost estimates as we go along. And then lastly, on the East Grand Forks side, we tie into Reinhardt Drive, but now this is a mile south of where the levee infrastructure is. So the cost estimates or the cost comparison right now does not include raising this road that full mile to get that into flood protection as well. So you'd need to really raise that to see the full benefits of the medium and high options. It was just a discussion where at some point we have to stop and quantify what we've got and then look for feedback and go from there. So now Brian will talk about the results of the hydraulics.
Yeah, so there's a lot of numbers up on the screen, and just the way this table is broken out, I'm trying to compare the low, medium, and high bridges at each location kind of relative to one another. And so the green is indicating kind of your best result for each bridge, whether it be low, medium, high. Red is your worst result. Just before I get into the numbers, so everyone's aware, 1 inch is about 8/100ths of a rise in the water surface elevation. And you can see these values, vary anywhere from 2/10 or down to about 5/100ths roughly. So again, we're not talking about a lot of rise. We're talking about 1 inch, maybe 2 inches at most that these bridges are causing. So this is the rise before we are mitigating any of it. So just purely if you were to put a bridge in, this is the rise you would see. So these values don't sound like a lot, but 1/10 of rise on the Red River, because it's so flat, actually propagates all the way upstream to where the Thompson Bridge is, which is where the Hartsville Coulee is, that splits off. And so if we didn't mitigate this, that would be many, many structures within that 10 miles of river that we would potentially be impacting. So this is the important for mitigation, because FEMA says, again, if it's an insurable structure in the floodplain, you cannot have a rise or impact on it. So we need to make sure that we take that, where that rise is happening right now over 10 miles, and shorten it up and get it to near just where the bridge is. So just real quick, I mean, everyone can see the numbers, but as we go through these options, on Elks Drive, the low 1 seems to have the best hydraulic results. So when you look at these low 1, low 4, low 1, low 5, a low 1 would actually be a bridge with a smaller beam, smaller superstructure. And then the higher, a low 5 or a low 4 would be a bigger superstructure. And so I guess the key takeaway from this is, and it's pretty intuitive, the more bridge that's in the water, the higher rise you're going to have, right? So if you have a fat beam in the water, it's going to cause the water to go up compared to a small beam. So the 32nd Avenue mid-op, or the low option there, was the worst. That were closer to 2/10. And then just going down to the line, medium bridge, Elk's only causing, a 2/100ths rise there. And then again, 32nd Avenue is causing a 1/10. 47th Avenue is pretty close on the medium option there of about 36 or 4/100ths. And then as we go to the high bridge, we're looking at only 1/100th. I would say all of these high bridge options are pretty equal in the rise that they cause. I mean, we're kind of splitting hairs there, but it's 1 to 2/100ths, I'd call it. And again, your bridge is well above the flood that we're looking at. And so it's just really, the only thing that's in the way there is the bridge piers themselves that would be blocking water. So results kind of as expected. Basically, again, the takeaway is higher the bridge, the less rise you have, lower the bridge, more rise you have. Bigger the superstructure, more rise, smaller, less rise. So this next slide is all about how do we mitigate that rise. There's a lot going on the screen here, but, whoops, I'm flipping my paper and not the screen. So up here is kind of on the left-hand side is the 32nd Avenue low option compared to a 32nd Avenue. This says medium. I know it's blocked there, but on the right-hand side. And so these are the bridge alignments that Wade was talking about earlier. So the one here is the yellow was the actual original alignment that was shown in the MPO study. So your flood protection limits kind of travel right here. And then, talking through the study with, Jason and Mark Walker, it was kind of asked to look at, well, what would happen if the bridge was just a little south of the flood protection again, so you don't eat up this kind of available land, putting in a new kind of major arterial roadway through there. So we kind of analyzed it, and the results you're going to see, in the study are talking about this southern kind of, we're calling it the preferred alignment. So if you hear me say 32nd Avenue preferred or 32nd Avenue south, I am talking about this dashed line here. Otherwise, 32nd Avenue, I'll say north alignment would be the original MPO. So other things on the screen, the green is the mitigation area. And so all this is supposed to depict is this is the actual area we would need to excavate to mitigate the rise in the river due to the new bridge. So the table on the bottom left shows the earthwork volumes. Sorry, I gotta lose this mask. I keep sliding off my face. Is the area of earthwork, and then we have the volumes that are associated with each bridge option, whether it be a low, medium, high. Again, the green depicts the best option when you're looking at lows, and reds are the largest amount of earthwork when you're looking at each bridge. To put this in perspective, so if we look at like 32nd Avenue High Bridge, it requires 60,000 yards of excavation to mitigate about 1/100th of a rise. So to put that in perspective, 60,000 yards, if you're using 20 yards per truck, it's gonna be 3,000 truckloads of dirt. When compared to, I'm just gonna use a really bad option, 32nd Avenue low bridge requires 1.4 million yards of earthwork to mitigate 2/10ths of a rise. That's 70,000 truckloads of dirt that you would have to move. So just when you look at the impact to costs, this has a very large impact on it. The next impact that I want to talk about would be mitigation for structures, which this is kind of something that developed late and we didn't get it built into the cost, but when we give the final report, we'll make sure they're built into the cost. But what happens with both the 32nd Avenue Southern or Preferred Alignment and the 47th Avenue alignments, they are both lie outside of, the East Grand Forks flood protection, and there's quite a few structures that are in the floodplain over there. We are unable to mitigate the rise just purely due to the river and bridge hydraulics that were causing an impact on those structures. So there's actually 8 structures on the Minnesota side for the 32nd Avenue alignment that would be impacted. And you would have to do some form of other, I'll call it like structural mitigation. So mitigation options that we would have to talk with these further with the landowners and FEMA, both would have to kind of buy into these. But first would be building like a ring dike around these properties. And that sounds simple enough, but it actually would have to be a certified levee, which is quite the process in itself, which I'm sure a lot of you are aware of. Obviously, we have a very big flood protection system in town, but that goes along, there's O&M that go along with that. Who's going to own it? Who's going to keep it up? Who's going to just make sure everything is on the up and up throughout the years? Next option you could look at for these structures, which it'd probably be the lowest, or I would say the worst option you'd actually look at would be actually raising the structure itself, picking up the whole basement, picking up the structure. That's just an extreme inconvenience to the landowner, and I don't see most landowners agreeing to that. And then the last one would be actually a property buyout. So if you were to let's assume you were to do property buyouts, that would add for 32nd Avenue about $2 to $3 million. That would be any one of those low, medium, or high options. As we jump to 47th Avenue, few less structures, talking about maybe 6 structures there. So maybe around $2 million that you'd be looking at if you had to do buyouts. Again, you have to do some form of mitigation because they lie in the floodplain. These would all have to be, investigated further as you got closer to a design. But I just want to, I guess, throw that out there that we are unable to mitigate 32nd Avenue South alignment and 47th Avenue with floodplain excavation alone. There needs to be some type of structure mitigation there also. And it's purely due to how close some of these structures are to the actual bridge alignment. We're just not able to wash out that rise quick enough. So again, I'm just going to talk through some key conclusions to hopefully kind of button up this hydraulic discussion a little bit for you. So we looked at low bridges, medium and high. It's, varying heights. Again, low is between that initial flood stage and 10-year. Medium bridge, 49 to 51 feet, somewhere between Sorley and Kennedy Bridge. High bridge, again, high and dry. As we look at impacts as they relate to the height and elevation, so again, rise is smallest for higher bridges, greatest for lowest bridges. Hydraulic impacts as they relate to the bridge configuration, again, bigger the beam, bigger the rise. Smaller the beam, smaller the rise. Hydraulic impacts as they relate to mitigation. So Elks Drive, far enough north, there's no structures in the floodplain near it. We're able to mitigate that one pretty straightforward by just doing floodplain excavation. That's the same for the northern 32nd Avenue alignment. That one's far enough north where we're able to just purely use floodplain excavation, and we're able to mitigate that rise. You don't have to buy out properties, anything like that. 47th Avenue and the 32nd Avenue preferred or southern alignment, again, have those other impacts that they're not insurmountable. It's just another thing to think about, I guess, if you were to actually proceed with any of those alignments. And again, there's added costs with that. And then just property impacts. This is more what Wade was talking about. It relates to just the heights of the bridge. So most of the property impacts are on the Grand Forks side, but the higher the bridge, the more properties you're going to affect, just simply to tie back the slope. Side streets tying into it, you may have to do cul-de-sacs, hammerheads, something like that. So again, higher bridges have the most amount of impacts. Lower bridges, again, have the least amount of impacts. Medium bridge would be very similar to a low bridge, because on the Grand Forks side, the high ground, we're just, again, this affects mostly Grand Forks. There's nothing really on East Grand Forks that we would get into as far as embankments. I think they're all avoidable on the Minnesota side. And then I guess you're not going to have any flood closures needed on your end, unless, of course, you wanted to make some kind of, gateway to the city or something. But definitely room to go up and over the levee on all of those.
Okay, wrap up with a couple more here. So this is a cost comparison slide, and both the MPO study and this study are high-level cost estimates that aren't necessarily, ultimately, when a bridge is built, it's going to be a different number. The cost is going to be different than what's up on the screen. It's going to be different than what's in the MPO, just because both studies are at a very early stage, and it's just, when you're looking at this many locations, it doesn't make sense to pour the effort in to try to really, really accurately, design everything down and get those costs. So what we try to capture here is just what are the relative differences between all these different options we're talking about. So the chart is organized by corridor, so Elks, 32nd, 47th, and then by low, medium, and high. And so I'll just go across one of these and just kind of show you what we did. So we have a bridge length, and we have a roadway length, and a project length. So you see the project length is pretty much the same everywhere because we're tying into the same points on each side of the river. So a cost difference comes between, a bridge is more expensive to build than a road. That's fairly obvious, right? But when you look at a low bridge, so like say this one here on Elks, we got about 10 million for the bridge, 5 million for the road. So that's a pretty good combination. But then you go over to this mitigation with that huge excavation that Brian was talking about. Well, now you got just as much cost in mitigation as you do in the road and bridge. So you got 30 million. Go to the medium, that's going to be dry and useful a lot more often than the low. And the road and bridge are more expensive, but the mitigation is a tenth of what it was. So your total cost is about the same. So in that instance, it doesn't make a lot of sense necessarily to do the low option. So that's what this chart is trying to show. And then for the color coding we have here, we just identified if we were interested in building a low bridge, which corridor should it be on from a cost perspective. So 47th has the lowest cost option for the low profile. And the green, Elks Drive, has the lowest cost for the medium, and it also has the lowest cost for the high. So, and then down here we have the basis for our costs, and you can ask questions about that or whatever. I'm not going to step through it, but essentially all we're trying to do is identify what are the relative differences. And I guess maybe one thing I will point out that we did incorporate, God dang, this thing is sensitive, better stop touching it, with the bridge costs per square foot here. I put different values on that for low, medium, high, just because as you get a taller and taller bridge, it takes bigger equipment, it's just more costly per square foot of bridge. So we're just trying to, again, identify ways that the different options can be separated from an effort and cost standpoint. So the next steps that we have, as Brian was talking about, is to go and start discussions with FEMA and the Corps on verification of the hydraulic results and mitigation options. Start talking potentially with landowners, depending on what the cities like to do to go forward with the next steps. But just to start talking about those impacts and what options there might be to mitigate those. And then I'm sure everybody's aware, with the Red River and the banks of the Red River have a lot of stability issues, and neither study has captured that yet, again, because it's a pretty detailed thing to do, but it is a factor when building a bridge on the Red River, that there might be some need for soil stabilization or just other ways to make sure that the crossing is stable. And so that needs to be factored in sometime down the road here. And then really, as Brian started off talking about, that this is a piece of the MPO study. So now this information can be passed to them, and they can take it and incorporate it into their study. And
one more thing I guess I would like to add to that next steps. As you proceed with maybe getting closer to the next phase, I guess, of the MPO study, I feel like it would be important that the cities, both Grand Forks, East Grand Forks, get together and try to come up with some kind of criteria to help rank these locations. And that's probably a lot easier said than done. But there's a lot of information, right, that's available. I feel like a lot of the options, they all have their merit, they all have their pros, they have their cons. And it's sometimes could be competing interests, sometimes they can align, but I really think that would be helpful to narrow in on a location. Again, this helped to bracket results of, should we be looking at a low or a medium or a high option? Again, looking through the study, I could eliminate a few of those options right now of like a 47th Avenue high option, just again, does not seem to have much merit because there is no high ground on the Minnesota side. You know, are you going to pay to extend a mile or more of roadway just to take advantage of that? You know, that's a tremendous cost that's not captured in this right now. So to me, I don't know, 47th high, I would kind of eliminate from the future consideration, but that's someone else's call. And then also the low options at Elks and 32nd. When you just look at the costs of those, like it just doesn't pay. I don't see the benefit. There's also going to be increased maintenance costs with the lower bridges because they flood more frequently. There could be removing debris from them more often. You could potentially have to remove like street lights from the low-lying roadway every time it floods. So there's added costs with that where, to me, I would throw out those two options. You know, there could be other intermediate options. Maybe you're looking at a bridge somewhere between the medium and high, not going up so much, but it gives you a more consistent level of service, and it's higher than what any bridge is in town right now. You know, so there could be some benefits there. So I don't know, those are kind of some of my key takeaways of options that maybe could be eliminated from future consideration. But.
Mayor.
If I could just interject a couple of things. First of all, thank you for bringing the mid option. You know, we hadn't heard of that. We'd heard of a low and a high mostly, but the mid option, I think at low, for example, Councilmember Helms would have said, I'm not voting for a low bridge, and maybe some others felt that way. Well, the high bridge that we've seen up to now, which was about double the cost of the low bridge, that was a stopper right there. And so if we didn't have the will to come with a low bridge, because it will flood all the time, and if we didn't have the dollars to come with a high bridge, it's really important to have that mid-bridge option. Price point similar to the low, but performance-wise, at flood time, closer to even the Kennedy, between the Sorley and the Kennedy. That's amazing. And secondly, we're starting to get a better picture how each of these corridors will affect the neighborhoods. You know, one of our goals is to really minimize the effect on those well-established neighborhoods on the Grand Forks side in particular. None of these really hit our neighborhoods that heavily. But now we're getting a feeling that 32nd Avenue would have a greater neighborhood impact in a variety of ways, and that's an important, to me also, take-home part of this study that you guys have done. And so I do appreciate, you know, it's one step closer to a clear picture of what is the best corridor, and it's a process. Please know, I don't think anyone in this room is locked on to one corridor as being where it has to be. It has to achieve the traffic objectives, you know, unloading Reeves and Belmont, and on our side, unloading Bigland Road, you know, all that extra north-south traffic. It has to achieve that objective, economic objective, and then also minimizing the effect on the neighborhoods. And again, I want to thank you for, through this process, you definitely have taken us closer to figuring that out.
No, appreciate that.
Thank you.
Glad to help.
Thank you, Mr. President. Couple questions. So the bridge type is a pre-stressed concrete beam. Is that the only type that was considered, or what?
Well, it's the only type we consider just for simplicity, just because we're just trying to compare relative, you know, impacts and costs and stuff like that. But so ultimately, there's other bridge types that could be done. It was just the scope of the study was relatively narrow when it came to the bridge type. So yes,
I mean, just wondering. I mean, I'm not a structural engineer by any means. Just wondering if there's other bridge types out there that would be higher, that would reduce the mitigation cost because of the type, or I don't know.
not necessarily. I mean, no matter what we do, there's going to be piers in the water, and you know, these impacts are this much. So unless you put in, you know, for the 4,000 foot long bridge, you put in the Golden Gate Bridge and you have nothing in the water. That's really the only thing. But in our area of the country, there's going to be piers. That's just the bridge types that are feasible on these types of soils and stuff like that. So it's a good question, but
That, I mean, some of those other bridge types, so it would be a trade-off of, yes, there's less mitigation, but then you're paying more for the bridge itself.
yeah.
So like, there could be maybe a little bit of a balancing act there. But again, we looked at, I'll call it like your standard DOT type kind of bridge is more what we looked at with this study, just so we can compare apples to apples, you know, as we look at each location. There is, I mean, I'll just say, there's an infinite number of options we could look at as far as alignments, as far as heights, as far as bridge types. So yeah, it was using more of our engineering judgment, I guess, in this what's typical for this area of the country.
Yeah, and what's difficult is anytime you're looking at a new crossing where there isn't one now, you're comparing your impacts to natural conditions. And that's, especially in the Red River Valley, like you were saying, it's so flat, you put a rock in the water, you know, and there's going to be some kind of impact because it's just so flat. So it's much easier when you're replacing a bridge that's already there, because you're always going to be improving on what was there, typically. So
What would happen, or in that type of calculation then, if, and I'm not going to suggest that this would happen, but what would happen if you removed an existing structure, say the Point Bridge, and added a different one?
Yeah, actually, that's a really good question. This is something, and I guess Mark saw it during our proposal, but we actually, just as a kind of a case study, we looked at removing the old railroad pier. What happens? It actually drops the water surface elevation by 400s, which, again, you can't, so I just got to say this. You can't remove the old railroad pier because it's historic. But that's to give you an idea. So like, the idea, another idea that came out is like, let's say you went with an Elks Drive bridge. Well, maybe you can get rid of the pedestrian bridge that's right by it. You know, do you need two? So maybe getting rid of the pedestrian bridge helps you with that mitigation.
Yep.
It's just, so yeah, you can do improvements or remove other structures that are also forms of mitigation. We didn't look at them with this.
Does it matter if they're downstream or upstream, or?
you'd have to remove downstream.
Yeah, downstream. So it'd be closer to downtown, you know,
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah, you're right. It's a good question, because it's a system. You know,
Yep.
they all
Yeah,
matter.
so I guess the way to put it is you could take something out of the water somewhere else.
Well, that's what I was
place it.
wondering. I mean, if you could figure out how to take, you know, create a bigger retention basin or something further south, would that be possible? But that doesn't affect it.
No, we talked about that through one of our technical meetings too. That was a question, and then it had to be downstream.
Yeah,
So you could do something further north?
To an extent, that was asked too, and it was like, no, you get that far, then it doesn't matter, you know, so,
it's hard to find that sweet spot where it's gonna,
yeah.
Well, I guess my
Make
point
a
is if
difference.
mitigation, you know, you're talking $20 a yard, part of that is disposing of the dirt. If you could find something that was further out of town, then you could just place the dirt. I mean, maybe you could bring those mitigation costs down. Granted, we're not getting into that.
you know, it could be a combination of something near the site, something outside, you know, when you get to it, there could be something like that. But I think by the time you get all the way, you know, outside of town, it's such a far distance that we don't see the benefit of it.
We just start digging the East Grand Forks boat marina, maybe, and go for that. No, I appreciate it. Like I said, we don't want to get too granular on this level of study. A couple questions on this slide particularly. The road construction figure, is that based on to Reinhardt in East Grand Forks? So it doesn't, there's nothing for, so connection.
You know, I'd say it's like, well, where you see those alignments, I mean, those are
Yep.
kind of the extents that we stopped. We didn't carry it to, there's going to be other infrastructure costs, right? Maybe you need traffic signals, or maybe you need to do other intersections. We kind of stopped on the red there, so yeah, kind of terminated at Reinhardt.
I guess my point is if for our own mind, if we're gonna start figuring it, yeah, you've got, you know, a mile of road that you have to figure out how to get traffic up Reinhardt if you start at 47th and versus half a mile if you go 32nd, and if you're at Elks, it's, or a mile at 32nd, 2 miles at 47th, and half a mile at 24th.
Yeah, those are definitely costs that would probably be best captured by the MPO when they're looking at, again, the total or bigger picture of traffic movement and, you know, what exactly you're gonna need.
And then, I just wanted to make sure that that's what that was saying.
Yeah, basically, we're trying to get to the flood protection on each side of the river.
Absolutely. And then the 32nd quarter cost estimates that you had on there, those are for which alignment? The You're calling it a preferred?
Yes, the southern.
So
Yep.
what, I mean, did you run cost analysis on the updated one? Or the
Updated.
The original?
Or
The original
This is
northern
the
one?
alignment that the costs reflect.
right, but if you use the north one,
We
that's
did-
where your mitigation goes.
We did
with
run
that.
hydraulics and mitigation on it. Mitigation is pretty similar.
Yeah, we forgot to mention that.
Yep, sorry. We did run that. Mitigation's pretty similar. You're gonna probably have slightly more roadway costs. I can't recall if we actually carried that original alignment all the way through the cost estimate, but it's not gonna have the property or the structure mitigation that we talked about on those like farmsteads and stuff.
I guess I would propose, instead of going that far to eliminate the roadway, is to bring it right to the actual levee and just build onto that levee and run the road top on top of that levee. The core project has levee that's road all over. I mean, you could do,
I'll have to look. There is a tipping point here of like, so you're talking about putting it maybe like.
right on top of that or something, yeah.
Yeah, there is kind of a tipping point there. We need to be far enough away from this area. Sorry, I know
So
that
that
people
you
watching
don't-
remotely can't see my hand.
Right, so that you don't have those impacts on that, okay.
Yeah. So there is kind of a tipping point where we want to make sure if you were trying to avoid that you want to stay away from this area. Because of the river hydraulics, and this again is well, I don't want to get too technical, but basically it has to do with the velocity, your kinetic and potential energy. Because it's so flat, this is a unique situation. I'll say like typically, a typical river, a tenth of a rise would wash out in a mile on its own. It's 10 miles on the Red River. It makes it more difficult. So there's literally nothing we can do. There's going to be some rise for some short span of river, even with the floodplain mitigation.
And all these are adjusted for their river mile increases, right? Because every mile the river goes up about a foot.
Oh, right.
So everything is based on those.
The hydraulic model takes that into account.
Yeah, we use the same hydraulic model that the Corps used for the flood protection design. Or was it? I forget if it was FEMA's or the Corps, but.
Thank you.
Anybody else have
back
anything
up.
at this time? Mr. Better?
One question I have is on the high bridges on Grand Forks side particularly, you didn't take into account any mitigation for homes where the road's up and over and then coming down to where we might have to buy homes out to make that road work on that side?
We did. They're reflected in the costs.
Okay.
We just didn't want to show that on anything at this point in time because it's not a design level. And so I don't
We
want
captured the
people-
relative differences between.
I don't want to get people too excited at this point.
Yeah.
So-
Why not? But it is, from a relative standpoint between low, medium, high, and then different corridors, that is reflected in the cost estimates.
It's right, so we're just at a very concept level. We're not at a design. We don't want to say, hey, this, is going to go right through your front porch or something.
Yeah.
It's not to that level. There could be tweaks and alignments further. You could shift north or south of the road, the actual right of way that's there right now, retaining walls, all of that kind of stuff.
Okay.
But yes, to answer your question, it was accounted for in the cost. So.
Anybody else have anything? Mr. Helms?
Has this been presented to the Grand Forks side already? or no?
Yeah, sorry, I should have said that. That was presented last night.
Okay.
I don't know, it's been kind of on KNOX radio today, so I didn't know if any of you had actually watched it on Facebook last night on the Grand Forks Council's side, but yes, that was presented last night.
Yeah, because you touched on it, the hard part is going to be negotiating with both sides of the river. It's going to take a lot of meetings and a lot of give and take here and there to get everything to.
Yes. I know narrowing down on a location is hard and right, there's not even necessarily agreement among all the council members on each side. There's different opinions I've heard, on the west side compared to the east side. And I should say, even between the members on the west side, you know, right? So that's definitely the hardest part of this.
I have a general, like, city engineering question, and maybe you guys want to take a hack at it or not. If you have two population centers, one on each side of a river, okay? And so you have residential neighborhoods and commercial neighborhoods and all built up against the river on both sides. Let's say that extends for 5 miles. Hypothetically, what's the best interval to place a bridge between those two centers? Would it be 7 miles, 6 miles, 4 miles, 3 miles, 2 miles, 1 mile, half mile? You know, what is a good interval to connect those communities? Essentially, it's one community on two sides of a river. Do you have thoughts about that?
I guess I'll give you
That's a tough one.
I'll give you an answer that you're probably not going to like. To me, it'd be more reliant on what the traffic patterns and what the corridors you're trying to tie into. That would be my answer. To just say that it should be 1 mile from here, 2 miles from there, I don't feel like is the correct answer there.
Yeah, I guess you could put it in terms of how interchanges are laid out in a city. The North Dakota DOT anyway prefers, you know, every 2 miles an interchange.
Yeah,
and every mile a grade separation. That's not relative here, but so that might be a number that's comparable because it's a similar type of connectivity issue that you're talking about.
And that is actually a number that we don't mind too much, because the farther you go beyond 32nd, you're really getting out beyond that number. Even the 2 mile number, and so basically you're forcing heavy traffic onto the Point Bridge, which also goes, of course, we know on the Minnesota 4th corridor by Phoenix Elementary, and then all that extra north-south stuff. That's what is created when bridges are too far apart, is a whole lot of redundant north-south traffic in this case, which is what we're trying to mitigate. And so that's the idea. There is some maximum separation beyond which it does not make sense between wear and tear on roads, you know, pedestrian safety, miles driven, you know, 50 cents a mile, whatever you want to do. Somewhere in there it becomes ludicrous to not have a bridge connecting those two communities just based upon all of it. Probably public safety first and then on down from there.
Yeah.
Mr. DEMERS.
Thank you. Sorry a couple other things. On the profiles, specifically on the medium and high level ones, so you're estimating piers everywhere that it's higher than existing elevation for that entire span? It wouldn't be like an earth, it wouldn't be piers over the river and then earth or anything like that, right?
No, it would be.
Piers all the way across.
Yep.
Yeah, so this kind of answers your question of like maybe you're looking at different lengths of the actual bridge itself.
Okay.
I don't
So
know.
you're asking if we looked at building the embankment into the
Yeah,
floodplain,
I
so
mean,
to
that
speak, and having
all of a
shorter-
sudden becomes higher.
Like, is it
mitigation.
piers from levee to levee?
Right. Sort of, yeah, it's kind of that way, because when you get a high bridge and you start to build embankment on the riverbank, then that slope stability stuff I talked about comes into play. So and again, this was very high level, so we're just looking at, you know, getting across.
That's the other important thing about mitigation. Again, doing that analysis of, you may be able to do more mitigation cheaper than you can build a longer bridge, right? So you could potentially, even if you went with a high option, you could say, we're going to do, instead of 60,000 yards, we're going to do 200,000 yards of excavation, and it's able to shorten our bridge by 500 feet, right? There's going to be that cost trade-off there.
And that's in the design phase.
Yep.
That's getting further in, yep.
I'm wondering, and I know this is based on hydraulics, or you have a lot of hydraulics and costs to it, but you touched on maintenance of different levels. Is there any benefit or to placement on rivers for bridges? Like, is a perpendicular crossing more beneficial long-term maintenance for piers, erosion, those type of things than an askew bridge, or is there anything to?
The initial cost of the bridge, but yes, it is a factor. But yeah, if you cross it askew, the bridge is longer. You know, if you're square to the channel, it's shorter.
Yeah,
Turning the piers then parallel to the flow, even on
Yes.
an askew bridge, the
Yes.
piers can still be parallel.
Yes.
Yeah.
yeah, there can be, you know, just depending on where it is in the river, you know, debris could tend to build up on curves.
That's what I was wondering
something
too, is
that.
like, does that factor in mitigation, the actual, I mean, at a lower level, it would affect it more. As you get higher, obviously, the bridge or the water's gonna go
Right.
straight.
It
But
definitely affects the long-term maintenance of it.
does it affect the hydraulics, whether it's on a bend?
No, I mean, as long as the piers are lined up with the channel like we're talking about, the hydraulic model is, you know, it's a technical tool, but it's not as fancy as maybe you might think, you know, as far as, it's just putting an instruction there.
Right.
So you put it perpendicular to the flow is how it is in the model.
This shows kind of the cross sections that we had to modify actually in the model. But like, so the yellow was the original river cross section that like they used for design, the Corps and FEMA. Well, the green is what we actually modified, and so what we're looking at. And so these are the cross sections that are put in the model. I don't believe it can't account for curves or anything like that. It's just purely kind of the cross section, you know, the stationing.
It's
But-
referred to as a one-dimensional model. It's just
Yeah,
flow
right.
going that way.
Is that what FEMA bases everything off of? Is that similar?
Yep.
But there is other costs associated with like curved bridges, like when you look at the Minnesota Avenue or the Point Bridge. I do know that one gets some debris and stuff built up on it, and so that was even a comment from one of the council members in Grand Forks. He just basically said, we don't want a bridge with a curve in it. They flat out said that. It's like, okay.
What about like on the approach? I mean, at some point, some of these have an alignment that curves. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
the roadway approach would be fine. He's just thought, he doesn't want he doesn't want another point bridge.
with the super on it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's feasible, you can build it, it's just not desirable typically, you know, to have your bridge on a curve and then the things that are associated with that.
Okay. I had one other question, but I forgot.
Anybody else have anything at this time? I know we're going to be getting together with Grand Forks. You know, we've already reached out and talked to them about getting together. So we'll keep the discussion moving forward. I think this, you know, seeing this information is a good way to start, and then hopefully we can keep building on it. So
One thing, I remember, like, so our bike path bridges have removable rails. Is that something that could be built into something like this? Or, I mean, to take some of that
That's another question that was asked in our group, and no.
should have been in your group?
Typically, no, traffic barriers are not removable because it's most likely going to be a concrete barrier that's cast with the deck and stuff like that. So street lights, pedestrian rails, things like that can be removed. But if you have a concrete rail on it,
Do I
it's going to be fine.
The railings on the pedestrian bridge are more of like a decorative kind of feature.
Okay.
And they're
You know,
metal.
pretty light
yeah.
duty kind of.
And debris will hit them and mangle them and stuff like
Yep.
that. But a concrete barrier for traffic on a bridge,
It's what it
it's
is.
going to be fine.
Perfect.
It's not to say it couldn't get damaged if you get a really big log or, you know, chunk of ice floating down the river, but that's the other disadvantage of a lower bridge, right?
Right.
You're going to have more of that potential compared to higher.
Yep.
Thank you.
okay. Anybody else have anything this time?
So,
Okay. Appreciate you coming in.
Yeah.
Good information.
Any questions? Yeah, feel free to reach out. We're supposed to be submitting kind of, I think, our final report here in a week or two. It's a big one. There's a lot of data in it, but so we tried to boil it down to this presentation. But if you look through that and you have any other questions, let us know.
Appreciate it. Thanks. Move on to number 2, the legislative update from Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities. Marty Seifert's here. I guess he has some handouts for us.
Take one and pass that down if you would.
Yep. Yep.
Does everyone have a packet that looks like this? Okay, very good. I'm just going to have you open this up, if you would, members, and get the packet with the staple in the corner that looks like this. It says East Grand Forks on it. And I'll try to be as quick as I can. My name is Marty Seifert. I am a lobbyist with Flaherty and Hood on behalf of the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities. If you open it up to the next page, CGMC is now over 100 members, 102 members. Of course, East Grand Forks is one of our, I think, original charter members, if not one of the really early adopters of the concept of having all rural cities that are, of significant size banding together for a common purpose. And as directed by the Board of Directors, our main focuses have been on local government aid and property taxes, economic development, annexation, land use, transportation, environment, energy, and labor and employment. And we have tried to stay honed in on those particular issues as the board directs us. Legislative session obviously was a huge roller coaster. If you look at the next slide, our expectations, it was going to be a short session. Everybody was getting along. They announced a $1.5 billion surplus. In fact, the legislators of both parties had talked about getting done early, being done by May 1st, shaking hands, getting a bonding bill done, and running off back home and having everything wrapped up. The reality, after our legislative conference in March, we were one of the last conferences that was allowed to be held, actually, was the CGMC conference in March. And you had a delegation over there that day, and we talked a little about your sales tax and some other things. And the reality was, after the CGMC conference the following week, there were no in-person meetings. We have had 2 special sessions and more to come. The surplus went from $1.5 billion surplus to $2.4 billion deficit in a matter of 4 months. We've had a battle over apportionment of federal aid called the CARES Act money. We've had civil unrest, policing reform, battle lines over executive powers, and a bonding bill that's still not done. So think of February and then think of where we are now. I mean, it just shows what an absolute roller coaster this has been. So if you take a look at the next page, and I think you guys might be in this picture, that's the last normal day was March 11th, and then just a few days later they declared the Capitol campus off bounds. We couldn't have lobby meetings in person. And, and I served in the legislature 14 years, so, for those of us that have the cell numbers of the legislators and can link up with them on Zoom, I had a weekly breakfast with some of them and so forth. There's an advantage to that, but for the people who don't, I mean, they were just kind of lost the rest of the session, didn't really have much for being able to get anything done. So our CGMC goals then and now, the pre-COVID, obviously we wanted a large bonding bill. We advanced legislation for LGA, tried to build on child care progress and some reform on environmental laws. After COVID, obviously still a large bonding bill, we're an advocate for that. CARES Act wasn't even thought of in February because we didn't really have the pandemic at that time. And that ended up being a huge battle that we had to fight, particularly in May and June. The child care challenges were exacerbated by COVID, but because the deficit showed up, there was no money to do anything about it. There's small business grants legislation, mainly on the federal level, and then trying to proactively work to protect LGA versus the advancement of trying to increase it. So what are some things that we worked on? We created a COVID-19 resource page. We hosted 4 labor and employment seminars because obviously a lot of our members have to deal with union issues and negotiations and discipline of employees because we always represent the mayor and the council, not necessarily employees and all of that stuff. We did a lot of informational emails on different topics. We hosted a webinar in the state budget and where we're at. Surveyed city leaders on their top concerns, increased production of our newsletters, and hosted a Zoom meeting with the governor. The CARES Act is something the federal government provided that came down to the state and local governments. We had a big battle on that kind of in May and June. If you take a look at the next slide, there's just kind of a time frame of late March when Congress passed the CARES Act. Early April, we got a $1.8 billion for the state of Minnesota. In April, we kind of had vague guidance and a lot of confusion on how it was supposed to work. In April and May, CGMC worked with other groups in the Department of Revenue to try to get the distribution formula figured out. We had a big fight you know, we don't pick political parties, but we had big fights between House and Senate on that. This is one where we sided with the Senate Republicans because their formula benefited the rural area better. And Hennepin and Ramsey County got their own appropriations from the federal government because of their size, and the original House proposal had them kind of double dipping in terms of getting extra appropriations. So we said, hold on here. If you do that, that means our members, like you, get less money. And you're taking from our people and giving to them. And so we ended up kind of winning that battle. We had a variety of discussions with the Department of Revenue, the governor, Senator Rosen, Representative Marquardt, back and forth. Put a lot of pressure on them, and finally, as you see on the far right, end of June, Governor approved $840 million distribution, and the first checks are going out here in July. I'm not sure if you guys have your checks yet or not, but they're on their way. July isn't done yet, but if you take a look at the next slide, there's a bar graph we put together customized for East Grand Forks. This is kind of how you would have been treated under the different proposals. The House regular session proposal was reflective of what the governor wanted. The Senate proposal, as you see, quite a bit more money. I mean, $300,000 plus is not a small amount of money for the city of East Grand Forks. So you kind of see why we were excited about that. All of our members were in that boat where they were getting significant amounts of dollars that were less, and mainly because they were going to try to skim off like $100 million for these other two counties. And so we put up quite a protest on that. The June special session proposal came down to $668, which we could live with, and that is what your final amount ended up being on distribution. So that is the money that you'll come. If you take a look at the next page, there's resources from the Department of Revenue. We've worked with the League of Cities on some guidance on frequently asked questions that your administrator and your finance officials can work with. I would say the U.S. Federal Treasury one is a step above worthless in terms of giving specific guidances. So I'd work on the revenue one and the FAQ from the league that we've been working on, and that sets up the guidelines of what you can use your CARES Act money for. So for example, if you have police, fire, etc. during this COVID period, they have a distinct time frame of when the COVID pandemic was declared. You can kind of offset salaries and expenses like that. You know, think about that for forward budgeting, and we're going to try to have some seminars and webinars on that, so to give some guidance on that, but it'll help your budget, no doubt. Next page is about bonding. CGMC called for $1.5 billion bill that included $200 million for wastewater. That's a big deal, drinking water and wastewater. BDPI, child care, housing, and local roads and bridges. And of course, COVID-19 made a large bonding bill even more relevant because of a stimulus effect of jobs and so forth on road construction and water infrastructure. So you can kind of look at, I'm not going to walk through all of this. The next slide talks about what we did month by month to work on bonding. The next slide is kind of, here's what we came up with in July. We worked with both parties, both bodies, and the governor's office. They came up with a $1.35 billion bill, largely reflected of the things we liked. They didn't do anything for child care grants, but the other stuff we were fairly satisfied with. But unfortunately, both sides yin-yang the bonding bill. One side was saying, we aren't going to do a bonding bill. We want police reform and all this stuff with the riots and whatnot. The Republicans are saying, we don't like the executive power the governor is doing, so we're going to hold it up. The police stuff got worked out and passed last week. The executive power stuff is still in dispute, so it got voted down last week. And in August now is when they sell the bonds from the last cycle, and the finance department, or Office of the Management Budget is what it's called now, said they don't want to have a bonding bill in August because it will screw up the bond houses. Moody's and Standard & Poor's don't want us having this political argument during bond sales from the last cycle. It's kind of like when you guys do a home loan and they say don't do some, don't go out and do a car loan, don't go out and buy a lake property during that time period of when you're processing your loan. That's a lot like what bond sales are. So I talked to Representative Erdahl, who's the ranking Republican on the bonding committee, over the weekend, and he said they're going to try to take another run at it and get everybody to get along in September when the bond sales are done and see if they can get this bill done. But we had a lot of road projects, we had a lot of water infrastructure that we need the money for. We didn't have a bill last year. And so it's very imperative to get this bill done. Next, just a little bit about the polyfluoroalkyl substance, which is a lot of these kind of pervasive forever chemicals that we've had in water bodies, and trying to get drinking water cleaned up in the sources. It is really extremely expensive to do this. We had a bill for $500,000 to study better ways of treating this on the front end or doing preventative methods. Of course, when COVID hit and people were afraid that the budget was going to be a disaster, this ended up being kind of a casualty of that. The next page, child care, same type of deal. We had some child care initiatives, around $14 million worth of proposals. The House Democrats were all excited about it. COVID hit, big budget deficit, money disappeared. That initiative kind of went away with it. There's a time frame on child care that follows that on the things that we were working on. Greater Minnesota, has a $40,000 child care slot deficiency, and that grows every single year. We have more deficits in child care because the more of these at-home daycare people are harassed out of business and they feel they're overregulated and that there's nonsense going on with how they're treated, these ladies that have the kids in the basement are saying, you know what, I'm done. And so then you lose another 10 slots, and you lose another 8 slots, and you lose another 5 slots. And county by county and city by city, you keep adding that up. If we're at a crisis right now, we're going to be there pretty quick. And instead of going in that direction, we're trying to find a blending of funding and regulatory relief. You're not going to deregulate your way out of this. You're not going to fund your way out of this. You're going to have to kind of come together, figure out some common sense solutions on this. Next page, state budget projections. As I mentioned earlier, $1.5 billion surplus was announced in February. On May 5th, they did a revenue projection upgrade, or downgrade, but an update that took us to a $2.4 billion deficit. I think some of you might know the rainy day fund and the budget reserve added together with the cash flow account is about $2.4 billion. So literally it took all of the money that we've stashed trying to be conservative budgeters. And CGMC, we have generally advocated for a healthy budget reserve because we know that the budget is like a roller coaster and that sometimes you just got to keep that cushion there. And had they spent that down to zero, we'd be sitting at a massive, massive deficit right now. But right now we're sitting, the projections are at, we're going to be at a rough zero. And I have a feeling because of the shutdown and the sales, all these small businesses were closed for months. We're gonna have a deficit, no doubt, next session. We just don't know how big it's going to be. I predict to be in the billions, but nobody knows.
Does that include CARES Act dollars?
No, CARES Act dollars were not appropriated and given to us per se as of, we didn't have that in the Treasury. Keep in mind, those are mostly pass-through dollars to local governments. And so, I hope they don't look at it and say, well, you can paper it over with CARES Act money, so we're going to whack LGA. We're going to make that argument very strongly that LGA has to be paid in time and in full, because you guys are all budgeting based on that. Crookston, 2/3 of their budget is LGA. If they yank that carpet out, you don't have a lot to work with.
And the CARES Act dollars are theoretically two-way, right? Like, if they're used, they go back?
Well, I don't know if they're sent back, but we expect every city to utilize their CARES Act dollars, and there's creative ways of making sure they're utilized, absolutely. Yeah. So the budget deficit, if you look at the options, they can deal with the deficit during special session. The governor is starting to do some things like a soft hiring freeze, and unnecessary state travel is cut off and things. Dealing with the deficit during 2021 regular session. Every day you don't deal with a potential deficit is a day that's a missed opportunity, because you're going to be worse. It just gets worse and snowballs. The governor can use unallotment powers, but that's only after the budget reserve and the rainy day fund are all drained down. So you have to burn through that first before like they could take LGA, or they could take away nursing home payments or school district payments or any of that kind of stuff. So right now, we're kind of in a holding pattern with the budget kind of shakily moving along. I did customize a sheet for local government aid. Now keep in mind, we're back, you guys, from year to year, we're frozen last year to this year. Now this year to next year, you go back on that old formula again. So you guys have a loss from this year to next year. And we are trying to get it built into the statute that you guys go back forever to be frozen at least. We had good discussions with Representative Marquardt. You know, they froze it from last year to this year, but they did not want to deal with LGA formulas this year. And so what we thought would be an easy solution, we thought we had assurances it could get done, but they didn't do it. And the tax bill never happened. So that's where it's got to be carried. So COVID messed up a lot of things, and not having a tax bill. We thought on the floor, if we offered a floor amendment, we could have got it potentially passed, but they never brought it to the floor because the tax bill just never simply got considered. Next page, November elections could shift power dynamics. We're the only state in the United States with a divided legislature. So we have a Republican-controlled Senate, a Democrat-controlled House. They're the only state in the country like that. They're either all Democrat or all Republican. Governor might be different, but every single state has a unified legislature except this one. So on one hand, nobody can go too crazy on one side or the other. On the other side, there's not a lot of accomplishments sometimes because they just kind of plod along, don't necessarily get along real well. So this November, the entire legislature is on the ballot of both bodies. Obviously, LGA protection is our top priority, and when deficits are announced, we usually go from offense to defense. We ask for more money in the good years, but then when things get into deficit, we basically have to say, hey, we got to keep what we've got and don't go backwards. Upcoming events, membership meeting July 31st by Zoom, so if you guys want to join in on that, you're welcome to do so. Fall conference tentatively is expected to be in person in Wilmer. Legislative Action Day is our lobby day, that's January 27th, and our summer conference got canceled this year because of COVID. It got pushed to July of next year in Red Wing, same city, because we didn't want to take that away from them. They were supposed to host it this year, so we just pushed it out a year, and the board wanted to honor that commitment to them. And then on the last page is the website, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. I got a couple extra pages in here. One is your LGA history. Been kind of generally, on the flat side between 2.3 and 2.5 million is where you've kind of hovered. CARES Act distribution, there's that same sheet. And then there's some key dates in here, and on the back side of that, we've got some of the things that we've been working on for looking out for your bottom line, labor and employment. We've done some seminars, how to deal with unions and how to deal with disciplining employees and all that kind of thing. And we're going to continue on our environmental issues. We seem to always have a bevy of environmental regulations coming down the pike. I know you guys are involved in that. Dispute with the Lake Winnipeg issue and trying to regulate our discharge. North Dakota kind of just does their thing. On our side of the river, we end up just getting absolutely crushed with regulations that are expensive and cumbersome. And so we are fighting that battle. We've been in contact with Congressman Stauber and Congressman Peterson's office to try to get them to object to some of the new regulations that the Federal Joint Commission is coming down and trying to push on us because of the Red River. So we are working on that as well. So with that, I don't want to take any more time. Stand for any questions that you might have. Here.
I can say, we've met in the past, and I think I've been able to say it privately, but I'll say it publicly. Without you folks down there, cities like ours would be in a world of hurt. It's so easy to lobby when you're in the ring right around the metro area to go into St. Paul and say, hey, we need this, we need that. And here we are way out in the hinterlands, and we would have a real quiet voice, if any. And so the fact that you exist, the hard work that you do representing all of outstate Minnesota, we sure appreciate it. You've made yourself available to us anytime we're ever coming down there and whatnot. We can meet and strategize, and even to the detail of working down our formula for LGA and trying to optimize that. just want to say thank you for all the work that you do. We're just really glad you're there.
I appreciate that. I know sometimes we rock the boat down there, and this CARES Act thing was one of the boat rockers where the governor's office was not happy with us because they were wrong, we believe, and there's only so much money in the kitty, and if you give it away to people to double dip, that means there's less for our members, and I think they figured that out at the end, that we had a good point, but it was looking in like late May, because the legislature didn't agree on a formula. Governor had sole authority to do whatever he wanted, and that was extremely important for us to explain to them in the most plain common sense terms that we could that formula had to be followed that the legislature came up with. So I mean, we worked very hard on that. And the problem is that's why we have the coalition, because sometimes the metro cities and the league don't always necessarily agree with what the rural guys want, and that's the nature of the beast of why we exist. Is sometimes Minneapolis, St. Paul, St. Louis Park, Minnetonka, Minnetonka and Woodbury don't get LGA. They don't care about it. So if it goes away, they care less, and that puts the league in a tough position. We like them, but when you have some members who don't care about something and others where it's a big deal, priorities kind of get mixed around a little bit. So we appreciate what they do, but sometimes we don't always agree, and it put the counties in a bad spot too, as you guys can imagine, when they have some members getting more money and other members not. For us it was an easy thing. All of our members got more money, so it was easy for us to be the bad guys or to be the heavies in this thing. But we didn't have any of our members, regardless of political ideology, location, size, or anything, tell us that we had to be pansies on this, and we appreciate that, because sometimes we do have to be a little tough. And then on the other side of things, sometimes we get tough with other people on other things, so it's just the way it is. As long as we're playing it straight, I think people appreciate it. Appreciate consistency.
Mr. DEMERS.
Thank you, Mr. President. Again, obviously, our biggest thing is LGA, stopping that bleed whenever they get back to legislating normally. I guess we need to really patch that hole. Is there talk about, I thought at one point they were talking about reconsidering the formula or having some sort of task force. Is that still in the works, or is that?
The House had talked about having a task force on LGA. They were going to put it in, and they were going to have a task force on local option sales taxes too, and that was another thing they wanted, of which we will, barge away on a seat at the table, obviously, if they do that. Our argument on local government aid changes is that, our membership has to be treated fairly, that whatever is decided has some consistency and some common sense to it. I would like to see it where, at least people are grandfathered in, and not going backwards unless there's a noticeable change in terms of their upgraded tax base and things. And in some cases, like you guys of War Road, there just needs to be an update that at least you don't go backwards. And you're two of the anomalies, along with Detroit Lakes and a couple of other members, where we just have to revamp the formula and make sure you guys get protected, not go backwards.
Right. And like I said, it's just something we want to be on, and you already touched on my second question, which was, having that local options sales tax process that they kind of outlined. Is that still moving, or is that again set?
They never brought it to the floor. It was in the original bill from the property tax division. We believe Representative Marquardt was kind of the pusher of that. He doesn't like the local option sales tax. I mean, he believes it's the regional centers benefit, the little towns don't, and I get that. He was Mayor of Dilworth at one time. So he kind of sees it as haves versus have-nots. Our point was that we don't have a lot of tools in the toolbox to work with to pay for things. We've got aging arenas, we've got different capital expenditures, we don't have a lot of options to pay for them. A city like you guys, you're going backwards in LGA, you've got a lot of needs, you've got aging infrastructure, and your hands are tied. And if there's a referendum of the people, which is my big deal when I was in the legislature, is that if the people vote for this, That's the ultimate local control, is a referendum by the people in your constituency. You know, I wasn't necessarily the biggest advocate for local option sales tax when I was in the legislature, but I always felt if the people can vote on it, they're voting to tax themselves and they understand what they're getting because it has to list out what you're doing. So at the end of the day, I think most of the legislators have respected that process. But right now, I think we just had a lot. What did we have, 26, I think, when you guys came down? We quantified them. I think it was 26 or 28. It kind of took them by surprise. We thought there'd be about a dozen, you guys being amongst them. And it mushroomed to more than double that. And so I think a lot of the legislators are thinking, oh boy, this is getting out of control.
Which I understand, obviously that makes sense, but it also, it's making a statement, right? Is that trying to do these things that keep us viable and, keep us fresh and keep all these things, have amenities. And like we said, like to be able to compete with, it might not be the same in central Minnesota, but people on the borders, like we're competing with Grand Forks and Fargo's and, so we need that, but we don't have, like you said, the tools in the toolbox. So it should say, make a statement as well as kind of be a cautionary thing. So, thank you.
Anybody else have anything? Thanks, Marty, for coming. Appreciate it.
You guys get a hold of us if you need anything. Give us a holler and we'll get on it. Resources are there. And we always like to see you guys at the conferences we put on too. It's great.
Thank you, sir. Looks like we're on number 3. We're going to move on to a later session. Reid had to leave, so move on to number 4, discussion on 2022 federal project. Mr. Emery.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening, Council. So the City of East Grand Forks is currently scheduled to receive federal sub-target funding again in 2022. The city does receive approximately $860,000 in federal funding, which is, it's a 80-20 local split. So, to receive the full 860 in federal dollars, we need to be looking at a minimum of about a $1.1 million construction project. With that said, currently on the STIP, the project that it's kind of targeted for those funds at this present time is the Bigland Road, Reinhardt Drive roundabout project. But, with that said, I know Jason just, every year kind of his priorities change too of, projects and needs and stuff. So we did sit down, kind of looked at our state aid system, and kind of laid out again just some potential projects, for your consideration. Again, the first of that project is the Bigland Road, Reinhardt Drive, roundabout project. And that project, again, we're trying to get the ball rolling here because, 2022 is coming fairly quick, and that Bigland Reinhardt project could potentially require property acquisition. Also, the Water and Light does have some major electrical equipment that would have to be relocated with that project. And I think they've estimated that work at, approximately about $100,000 too. So again, I think if, this was the project we chose, Water and Light would have to plan for that and probably relocate their equipment, next summer, kind of in preparation for our work in 2022. So with that, with the Bigland Reinhardt roundabout project, I did kind of do have a couple options there. Option number 1, that one would require potentially some property acquisition on the east side of Bigland. I think that option we could probably shift the roundabout far enough south just to basically affect probably just the one parcel there on the east side. And then with option number 2, we kind of just shifted the roundabout kind of to the northwest there, because right adjacent to Hortons there, we got a lot of right-of-way there. So we kind of, shifted that. That option right now, probably would not require any property acquisition. It would require property acquisition in the future if, due to AM peak periods, we were required to put almost a second lane on there. There too, I mean, kind of our previous discussions tonight, I think if we ever get a south end bridge, I don't see that we'd ever even need that second northbound lane there. So that's kind of those two projects. We are estimating that project currently at about 1.5 million in construction dollars. The other project we looked at is out in the industrial park, and that would be on 10th Street Northeast. And again, even this project, I mean, the scope isn't, we're just throwing out some ideas for you. So what we're looking at is on 10th Street, maybe we would look at reconstruction of the street from basically 11th Avenue to 15th Avenue, and then a potential, street extension from 15th Avenue going east there for about 1,100 feet, I think is what we had kind of figured. Again, that project would include complete reconstruction, subcutting the street, putting in a new gravel base. Probably most important out there is getting a good drain tile system. I think with American Crystal Ponds right there and just leakage from those, we got a lot of subgrade water that quickly deteriorates our road section too if it doesn't have a good base section and drain tile. Also be looking at probably replacement of storm sewer, manholes, catch basins out there. Also underneath that road right now there is a clay tile sanitary sewer system that we'd want to get replaced. The water main is PVC out there, so I think unless we have some hydrants, valves, stuff like that, we'd have to replace. But for the most part, I think water main is going to be pretty good. And again, on that project now, we haven't really even ran any numbers just to see, what our estimated project cost is there. That's something we would definitely start to look at, kind of refining the scope of work if that's, the option we would choose to go. And then, basically 10th Street and, the next one we're going to talk about, both of those projects would require, modifying the STIP to get either one of those two projects on the STIP for funding. So, and maybe even now's a good time too on the 10th Street stuff. Jason had just even told me a little bit about some storm sewer issues. I think they just found out in that area today. So, Jason, do you have any comments on 10th Street?
I guess the way I look at the projects are what's going to serve us best and where's the biggest need. Is there a need on Big One for the roundabout? Some would say yes because of the time they had to wait to get onto Big One. And is that a reason? Is that a reason to put in a roundabout and spend $1 million there or not? You look at Big One and it's in good shape. The side streets are in pretty good shape, stuff like that. But 10th Street on here is not in good shape. And the pictures that Steve included in this presentation here, this request for council action is, you can see that the street is broke up, but unless you go out there, you don't really get a gist of how bad it is there. So we have infrastructure there that's actually failing. The storm sewer system, we're going to find out what kind of condition the pipe is in here shortly when we have it cleaned and televised, but right now there's catch basins in the intersection of 11th and 10th for sure that are in really rough shape that we're going to have to do something with here soon. We did discover today where some of our problem was with the flooding out in the industrial park. It would be east of the pink section you see on the map on 10th actually. There was a catch basin manhole that was washed out. You couldn't see because of the grass and stuff around it. When we went to inspect some of the manholes before our cleaning here, we noticed, and so there's going to be a major repair there done here in the next couple days to that storm sewer system. But the infrastructure is old along 10th, not only the street, but the sanitary sewer and storm, like Steve said. And when you get east of 15th Avenue Northeast, the road is just a little bit better than a dirt road there. You know, there's been some material put down, but I know that Zavros have issues with people driving into the beet plant, other contractors that can't even pass the road. They have to drive up on Zavros' lot to get around it, up onto their concrete to get around the road because it's almost impassable. So there is a lot of usage down there too. And as far as the needs, I think that this street, in my opinion anyway, is a bigger need than a roundabout on Bigland. Not to say that that's not a need, but I guess the way I would prioritize it, this would be a higher priority for myself. So that's the way I look at it anyway.
Okay, thank you, Jason. So then the third project that, Jason and I just discussed, and again, this project was kind of identified also in the Bigland Road study, was, potential roundabout at Bigland and 13th. Back in 2018, we did put in the medians out there. We did put in the pedestrian crosswalk system, but, there has continued to be some concerns out there, still for pedestrian safety, and kind of accessibility onto Bigland, especially in the AM peak periods. So again, just kind of throwing this project out there as, something, just for your consideration. In the Bigland Road study, they were estimating that project at about 2.4 million. And I do not believe with that potential project, I do not believe that we would, that would require any property acquisition at this time. I think we got pretty good right away over there. So again, for any of these projects, proposed funding, again, we're going to get federal sub-target dollars. We would be able to use state aid allocation funds. And then also I did throw in their assessments, because your current assessment policy states for state aid route reconstruction that the property owners will pay 30% of, all applicable front and end benefits. So again, that's just another avenue, I guess, that we could help to fund that project. So I think with that, I guess I just kind of open it up for any, questions that you may have, or if you guys have any opinions on, which direction we should be looking to go here for our 2022 project. So that's all I have at the moment.
Mr. Helms.
Yeah, I guess I would tend to agree with Jason on that 10th Street and Industrial Park. We need to do something out there. We can't let those people that are out there in the Industrial Park keep operating under the circumstances that they get there 2 or 3 times a year. So we need to do something there really bad. I think that's more important than the roundabouts on Bigland. That would be my opinion.
Mr. DEMERS.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just to clarify, these dollars need to be spent on a state aid classified road?
That is correct, and I even believe that with our federal dollars, the road has to be not only on our state aid route, but has to be like a minor collector or above. It can't be almost just a, kind of a local street or whatever, a minor collector.
Okay, I know in the past when we were talking about this, and I thought it was when we were doing the quiet zone, I had asked to get a map of the state aid routes that we have classified, if I could get that. Either a PDF or, I don't know if you could work with Corey, and I know it's down right now, but the city's GIS system would be nice to be able to put that on there and allow for viewing, just so, I guess it's hard for us that don't know exactly which route is exactly state aid everywhere to start brainstorming these projects. Obviously, you guys work with this and trust your and Jason's hands-on experience and stuff like that, but I think it would be beneficial for us to be able to see those. Wondering a couple different ideas. Now, with the quiet zone implementation, wondering if there's anything that we can do along with that if there's state aid roads, we could offset any of that cost. I know we're eliminating some of those state aid roads that are adjacent, but if there's any additional cost, if we can put it on that. Wondering about, with the elimination of that area by the 3rd Street crossing, wondering if we have any miles left, or if we're like right up against it, if we could look to extend the urban section on Reinhardt any further. I know that that's becoming a kind of an issue with the pavement out there falling apart, and it's a Band-Aid that we're going to have to keep repairing until it's actually constructed properly. And then, yeah, those are the two big ones, and then obviously like some sort of a map so that we can kind of start fitting this in. I guess the other thing too is, if our frontage roads to state aid, like trunk highway roads, are those frontage roads considered eligible or not? Those have to be designated as well.
They have to be designated roads. I think, again, the frontage road from, the frontage road like by the old Holiday gas station, cut by currently by Subway over to Costco, Pomida, that frontage road there is on our state aid system, but
Okay.
not all of the frontage roads are on our system.
Okay.
Maybe to answer your question, Mark, as you recall, we were over on our state aid mileage, so with eliminating basically 3rd Street off of our state aid system, that puts us pretty close to our max allowable mileage. It was very little additional mileage we have to add. And then Jason and I did look at potentially lowering Reinhardt from 13th Street there going south. But once you get to about Brandon Boulevard there, half of Reinhardt is actually out of the city limits. So we actually felt at this point, until some more of that property just east of Reinhardt is kind of annexed into the city, I think once that is done, then it probably makes sense to lower Reinhardt basically from 13th Street all the way to city limits there. And Jason's currently, I think, getting estimates to basically repair Reinhardt yet this summer. So we just felt too, being he's gonna, kind of put some maintenance dollars into it, this year, probably didn't make sense either to be, redoing it again in 2 years. So we did look at that project. Didn't feel that maybe that was the best option at this point. So we, did not include that as one of our options.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any? Mr. Mayor, you had something?
I think probably from past conversations, the roundabout that could happen at 13th and Bigland is probably a non-starter, at least in this particular conversation. If anything, I know we put into that long-range plan, the roundabout, that would be at Reinhardt and Bigland, and that kind of has some standing. And the question is, do we want to take that off of our top priority for these dollars? And then do we want to allocate those dollars to one of these other options? And I sure like the idea of improving that road along the industrial park right there, along with the suggestion that you've made. So I just think for our folks might be listening, and anyone else who's concerned, unless someone disagrees. And again, you guys, I appreciate you laying out the additional options that could be there, down to the possibility of a roundabout at 13th and Bigland, but I don't think that's even in consideration at this time, at least from what I sense of the group. It's either, if it's going to be a roundabout, the first one built would probably be at Reinhardt. The question is, do we want to lift that out of contention and then allocate these dollars elsewhere? Does anyone agree or disagree with that?
I think I would agree with you on that. I think, Jason's brought up 10th Street numerous times, and I think that needs to be tended to right away as fast as we can get to it. I do agree in some sense that a roundabout will help, but I think doing something to a road that's fine right now, that doesn't need any structural repairs on it, it'll help, yes, the flow of the traffic, and I get it, I understand it totally. But I think something that looks like the 10th Street does, and like you said, the pictures probably don't do it justice, what it does look like really, if you go by there, you know, lately. So that's, I would agree with you, Mayor, on that, so.
Council President, if I may interrupt, I believe we have a department head that's been trying to get your attention. I believe Miss Ellis is.
Sorry.
I just wanted to make the comment, just so it's clear. We have federally aid designated streets, and that's what this covers, not all state aid streets. It's a very different map. And 10th Street is still on that, so that's still a great project, but I just want to be clear that it's not, for city sub-target dollars, you can't put it on any state aid street. It has to be federally aid designated streets. And so all of our federally aid designated streets are typically state aid streets as well, but there is a separate map. Earl, I know for sure, has that map, and I should have a copy of it as well. But just, it eliminates some of the state aid streets. So the list of projects that they have available are all federal aid projects, but our frontage roads are not.
Send them both.
Thank you, Nancy. Mr. Vetter.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. President. We've done a study on Big London. We've had problems with traffic out there for years. The roundabout was supposed to be done 3 years ago. We took it off the STIP to do a bunch of maintenance projects for Jason back then. It's on the STIP now to be completed in 2022. This project would alleviate numerous traffic congestions and problems for the entire city, because everyone travels that road that has children to drop their kids off at the school on the south end. Although 10th Street is in bad shape, I don't think it rises to the level to step above this roundabout. I think the roundabout needs to be done first. It's traveled immensely more than the 10th Street one is. It's going to benefit more of the citizens in our town, and the money should go to where the citizens are using the road. So for me, I'm still on a roundabout. I'm for the option 2 where we don't have any property acquisitions, because I agree with Mr. Emery that when we get a south end bridge, we're probably never going to have a 2-lane road here. You're still going to need the roundabout even with a south end bridge just to maintain the traffic flow, because it's a headache the way we've got it now. And yeah, the road's in good shape, but the traffic doesn't flow on it. So we need a roundabout to fix that problem. It's been studied and it's been recommended. It's about time that we follow some of the recommendations of all these studies that we do and put the roundabout in. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Anybody else have any comments? See none. Mr. Emery, I think, I'm not sure where you wanted direction on at some point of getting clarity of throwing something, coming back with something, having taken something off. And I know that, discussion of the roundabout and 10th Street are probably the option 2, and 10th Street are probably the ones that'll probably be talked about mostly.
Yeah, and again, that's what I'm looking for the council from is, I think we just need to make a decision. Then are we going to go with the Bigland Reinhardt roundabout, or are we going to go with the 10th Street project? So I don't know if we're going to be ready to make that decision, next week, or, if you need some additional information from me.
I think you made a comment in there that 10th Street, you don't really have any costs or completed. Is that something?
That's correct.
So, I think that's going to mean a lot when you're looking at it. Let's say we find out it's, quite a bit more than we're thinking. I think maybe that's something that we need to have in front of us to make our decision.
Okay.
I mean, does everybody else agree with that? I would assume that we need that dollar amount.
Yeah, I fully agree. If you could bring in some of the other costs associated with the roundabout, bring it down to a total dollar. I know you haven't done that just lately, or maybe you have, but we haven't seen it. And then including what would be the local share after we would utilize all the federal dollars coming in and whatnot, just what that local share would look like. And then including source of those funds of where we'd come up with that money. If you could talk to staff on some options there, I'd appreciate it.
We'll do it. I'll get some of those costs put together and we'll bring it back to another work session for discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Excuse me. Unless anybody else has anything else on that, we'll move on. Alrighty, move on to number 5, consider special event request for Spud Jr.
That we had going on, I wasn't 100% sure when this would be happening. So he sent me the information that was included in the RCA, that he's looking. They are not holding Rockin' Up North Fest this year. It's been postponed until next year, and he would like to utilize some of the talent that he had booked for that weekend, and would like to hold a grand opening on August 22nd. His plan would, and there was a map included. He'd like to block off a section of 3rd Street, basically from DEMERS to about the alleyway, right at the end of the options building. And in that space, he would like to place tables 6 feet apart. Based on state guidelines, there would not be more than 250 people allowed. Everyone that would be in would have to purchase a ticket. It sounds like they might have, groups of friends or, groups come in. So once you're at your table, you stay at your table. He said everyone would enter the same way and kind of be asked the same questions sometimes when you go into some places here in town. So they would, be checking, making sure everyone's okay. And then there would not be any dancing allowed. Like I said, there'd be bands. There's not going to be a dance floor. There's no dance, or, I'm sure people will be dancing at their tables, but there's not going to be an area for people to mingle and dance and stuff like that. And he'd be securing the area with fencing that they would be getting, and possibly using some picnic tables from us, but just keep everybody spread out. So that's what they are looking at. And if you guys have any questions, comments, concerns, is this something that can be brought forward at the next meeting for approval? Because again, it would involve the street closure, and that's something that you would for sure have to approve.
Yeah, to add on to that with Megan, is I did talk to Justin, and I asked him to be a good neighbor and reach out to Cabela's and options and to talk to them. He immediately walked over to Cabela's and talked to them, because they do have that parking lot there for employees mostly that park there, and they would only close the north end of that parking lot. They still have the south end open, where they can come and go. Cabela's, he did talk to the manager, and they are fine with that. So he did take the initiative to go over there and talk to them. And I think this is a good, something that's positive going on. I think it's something that, some people are looking forward to doing. Mr. Murphy, do you have something, or? Okay. But I would support it, so.
I'm sorry, I was just, what do we marry? No, sorry, I didn't have anything to say.
I was trying to be more observant, sorry, Mr. Demers.
Nancy was raising her hand. Oh, wait, she was combing through her hair. I'm just kidding. Beyond barricades and allowing them to close the street, what else? It was kind of unclear. Are we asked to provide all these other, the fencing and the...
They will be renting the Batmobile. Our snow fence, what I was told is that our snow fence is in very rough shape, so they would be using our posts, but they would be getting snow fence from somewhere else. So yes, some of it would be coming from us, some of it would be coming from other sources.
Okay. I guess I'm fine with renting the stage and the you know, I think our barricades and everything are included in our fees or whatever, I think, but I just,
The bandmobile is a separate charge.
that's
for
what I mean,
sure.
it's
Yeah.
a rental.
Yeah.
But I just think, I mean, if these people want to, you know, put these barricades up and control their stuff and whatever, I just think it should be theirs, and unless they want to work out a rental agreement or something with that, I don't know.
Mayor?
You know, Rockin' Up North, this is the same organizer that has done Rockin' Up North the last several years, and that thing has been gaining momentum every year, and it's kind of nice. I don't know if any of you knew, maybe some of you did, there was the possibility that they would have Rockin' Up North this year, but on the other side of the river. And through a conversation back and forth, and I'll just tell you, Justin loves this community. He loves living here, working here, owning a business here, and he's all in. And so when he came back with this idea of having a smaller event inside of that 250 number, to keep that momentum going in a smaller scale, because momentum's a funny thing. It builds and builds, but you know, you fumble at the goal line and you lose your momentum, and it opens the door for something else. It could go a different way. And so the fact that the momentum of Rockin' Up North stays right here, probably the lid comes off even more next year. You know, we were going to move it over to by the memorial there along near the campground, and it was going to be a bigger space with a hard surface. And probably that'll happen next year. They're on board to try to, again, take it up a notch. And so thank you to anyone who's shown a general support for this. I think they're a good business, and it's a good draw for our downtown. Talking to the folks at HB, one of the things I asked them, you know, what do you enjoy about doing these things? I like to transform an area. One minute it was a parking lot, and the next minute it's a place where people are gathering, having fun. And they're so good at it. And so I'm thankful that, again, we have those kind of people in this area that can bring that. And thank you for being supportive of it.
Reid.
I also talked to Justin, and I know he's got a lot of money already invested in this. He also did a lot of work on his building. So he wants to be here, and I think we should just help him. It's a good idea.
Anybody else have anything at this time? See none. Thank you, Megan.
Yep.
Number 6, consider final approval of a replat of Emerson's Estates, 3rd edition. Ms. Ellis.
Thank you, Council President and council members. Sorry. I got a bad back from sitting there a little bit too long. Emerson Estates, 3rd edition, are the group of townhomes that are being built on 17th Avenue Southeast off the Coulee. Currently, he has 2 units being built. The 3rd unit, which is just north of 13th, is a triplex, so 3 townhomes. It has not been built yet. He still owns it. What he's asking for is for the northernmost unit and the middle unit to move that property line that's shared 4 feet to the north, so that the garage can have a side door and they can enter and exit that side garage door without walking on someone else's property. So the middle unit may increase its square footage by, with that 4-foot movement to the property line because of the 0 lot line between the buildings, but nothing else is changing. No easements are affected, no right-of-way, nothing else. So it's a very a small movement because it's a simple stub or movement of a property line between 2. We do not need planning commission approval. It can go straight to the city council. So I'm just wondering if you have any questions or concerns. Will be noted on the PUD plan. The PUD plan is a group of requirements that are listed in terms of square footage, setbacks, those types of things. None of that is changing. So it'll just be shown on the PUD plan with the movement of the lot line.
Okay, does anybody have any questions? I see none. Nancy, thank you.
Thank you.
Number 7, consider approving a revised loan rate policy. Mr. Gorte.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the council and mayor. In 2015, the EDA and the city council set policy for the loan rates, the interest rates to be charged on city loans. One of the things we've learned during the last few months is that we need to have more flexibility, and in order to do that, we recommended that there be a change in that policy to extend it to anchors, business anchors that may be in downtown or elsewhere in the community, and also to be able to handle emergency loans that they've been working on in order to help our smaller businesses survive. And all this does is add the language to allow that flexibility.
Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Gorte? I see none, sir.
Thank you.
Mayor, I know you had something you wanted.
Yeah, just one last thing. Probably a good chance to talk about this Executive Order 20-81 about mask or face coverings in certain public gatherings and places. To many of us, it feels like an executive order to wear a coat in the wintertime. We should have that freedom to decide what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, when we're going to do it. And in some way, it kind of violates common sense because a lot of us were angling that way. But this one is a little bit different. It's a little bit different. Even though I don't like being told what to do, the reason this one is different is we're affecting a lot of other people with our decision of whether to wear a mask or not. According to a study that was put out in the Health Day News on July 23rd, I was curious how many people in American society have one of these underlying conditions that we would say puts them at a higher risk of the complications of COVID. You know, if it's 2%, that's one thing. If it's a lot higher than that, that's another thing. Turns out, in a careful study, cross-section of the whole United States, 47.2% of our population have one of these risk factors that put them at higher risk for severe complications of COVID. And so suddenly the idea of wearing a mask or not, well, gee, all these cases, the ones that are ending up in the intensive care and on ventilators and some of them unfortunately dying, well, they had some underlying condition. Well, and you almost just write it off as that until you realize it's 47.2% of us. And so suddenly it makes a good, strong case. Again, I hate to be told what to do, but it does make sense. All day long I see patients. I'm within 1 or 2 feet of them most of the time. And of course I'm masked and gloved and eye protection, and so are they. But in fact, it's that same environment a lot of times in the stores we go to, in the places we go. And half the people in there are at higher risk for the complications, the severe complications of COVID. So there's that. And again, I appreciate on the similar subject, I appreciate the work that our schools are doing, pushing hard to figure out how do we reopen, what does that look like, what are the precautions involved. And I respect all of the moving parts that are involved there, from the faculty to all the administrators to the bus drivers, the paras, everyone else that'll work with the kids, to do that safely, but to find a way to get those kids back. I've been running a little survey of teenage kids that I see every day, and I like to ask 2 questions. Number 1, can you think back in your mind to 1 year ago? 1 to 10, how much did you like going to school? And the answer I'm getting is like about a 2. I don't like school. School's awful. Back then, and now, how juiced are you to get back to school right now? And they're like 10. I can't wait to get back. So even the kids, I know that's not the compelling factor because we got to do it safely. We got to keep, all of our people safe and all of that. But even the kids know they thrive in the classroom. They're going to move ahead. They're going to see their friends. There's just a lot of reasons to do that. And again, I know it's a really tough decision for every school district to make. But I do want to say thank you to all of our schools working hard on that to get our kids back in the classroom. And try not to be too crabby wearing the masks out and around, knowing that about half the folks that you bump into really need to be protected from whatever we might spit out our mouths. Thanks.
Thank you, Mayor. Entertain a motion to adjourn. Moved by Vetter. Second by Johnson. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion is carried. Meeting is adjourned.